Welcome to Total Health Magazine on Total Health TV. I'm your host, John Barson. Today we are going to be talking about legislating totalitarianism in British Columbia. It's a thing. It's a real thing. We're going to get into it today with Dr. Matthew Cockle. He is the author of the presentation of the same name, Legislating Totalitarianism in BC. I really wanted to talk to him about his critique. He was informed by legal experts like Gail Davidson and Paul Jaffe of three recent British Columbia laws: the Emergency and Disaster Management Act, EDMA, the Health Professions and Occupations Act, the HPOA, and the Legal Professions Act, or LPA. Dr. Cockle argues that these acts, passed into law since 2022, undermine democratic governance, erode constitutional protections, and establish authoritarian control by empowering unaccountable administrative bodies, political appointees. The laws are accused of bypassing the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, judicial oversight, and democratic lawmaking processes, aligning with global agendas like the World Health Organization's international health regulations and the World Economic Forum, the WEF, their initiatives. His presentation frames these developments as a covert transition to totalitarianism, right here in BC. Today we are going to focus more on the HPOA, but we'll have him back to touch on the other two laws. We will have to touch on the other two laws because all three work together. But not to worry, we'll have Dr. Cockle back to do a deeper dive into both the EDMA and the LPA, and hopefully we can do that sooner rather than later. But first, I'm going to play a teaser. Now, first of all, let's understand that the HPOA, which is the Health Professions and Occupations Act, it impacts all health professionals that require licensing in order to serve the public in the province. Here's the list of the different types of health professionals this directly impacts: medical doctors, naturopathic doctors, nurses and nurse practitioners, midwives, psychologists, dentists, chiropractors, dietitians, registered massage therapists, optometrists, pharmacists, physiotherapists, audiologists, traditional Chinese medicine doctors, and acupuncturists. So every health professional in the province. So we'll start off with this teaser. I made this teaser. It's actually not a teaser. I made this reel in the week prior to the election last November. I just learned about the HPOA 1 week before the last election. I'm embarrassed to say that, but I had no knowledge of it. I just was not aware of it. So we quickly did a series of interviews. We created a Dr. X, who was actually an actual health professional, but in order for him to host the interviews, we had to mask his identity, because just by doing that, he would be a target of these fines and potential jail terms. And I want to mention too, in the reel you're about to watch, which is just over a minute long, one of the things we point out about the HPOA are fines up to $200,000. Yes, that's true. However, subsequently, I learned a lot more about the fine process. If you're a doctor working in a clinic or say a hospital, but if you're an incorporated doctor, if your business is your clinic or whatever, if you're incorporated, the fine is up to $500,000 plus the $200,000. So, and most doctors, independent health practitioners in the province, are incorporated. So they're literally facing up to $700,000 in fines and up to 2 years in jail for what we're really not sure. But we'll find out more about that right after this. Why are so many doctors leaving BC? In 2022, the NDP passed a law giving the government complete control over all healthcare practitioners in BC and your health. It's called the Health Professions and Occupations Act, or HPOA. Under the HPOA, doctors and health practitioners must only follow government guidelines or they risk loss of license, fines up to $200,000, up to 2 years in jail, and these penalties can even be imposed for sharing information. This means doctors can only do and say what the government tells them to, instead of following their medical training and experience. Anonymous complaints can now result in immediate suspension of license even before the complaint is investigated. Who would want to work under these conditions? Good doctors and health practitioners are leaving the province or retiring early. If they go to Alberta, we know it's not for the weather. Your records are no longer private. Government appointees can enter a healthcare practice and seize patient records without a warrant. The HPOA is already law and will be fully enforced this summer. The NDP passed this law and refused to change it. Concerned health professionals of British Columbia are committed to repealing the HPOA. Visit hpobc.com for more information. Help us save healthcare in British Columbia. So that sets up the show. I want to bring in my guest now, but first his bio. It's Dr. Matthew Cockle, and he is by training a literary and religious studies scholar specializing in English Renaissance and Reformation. He has attended universities in the Czech Republic, France, Germany, and Switzerland, completing a master's in history at the University of Paris and a PhD in English just down the road at the University of British Columbia. Over the course of the declared pandemic, he became increasingly involved with the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. He continues to volunteer with the CCA as co-chair of the Ethics and Legal Committee, but feeling equally compelled to respond in an individual manner to the infringement of rights and freedoms throughout the declared pandemic. And he has created an educational and rights advocacy website called Constructive Dissent. And of course, we'll have links to everything we talk about below this interview on both YouTube and on Rumble. The Constructive Dissent website is dedicated to imparting information, inspiring debate, encouraging individual and collective action to restore and protect democratic, rights-based rule of governance. The most up-to-date Health Professions and Occupations Act slides that we're going to be talking about that are in his presentation, which inspired me to reach out to him for this interview, were prepared by retired lawyer Gail Davidson, and they're to be found on the Constructive Dissent website. So I encourage you to go to the Constructive Dissent website and watch his entire presentation. It's only an hour and 8 minutes, but it's the most important hour and 8 minutes you will ever spend this year if you live in British Columbia. So welcome to the show, Dr. Cockle. I know you're busy. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me and help me come to grips with this. I want to say this off the top. All right. So as I mentioned at the opening of the show, I was encouraged to get involved when I learned about the HPOA only 1 week before the election. And the thing is, in preparing and doing those productions and watching those interviews and editing and getting everything ready and listening to Dr. Zhang and Dr. Hoff, who is just amazing, and Dr. Stephen Malthouse and Paul Jaffe, I just couldn't wrap my head around how the government pulled this off. I mean, I'm looking at it, and so over the next couple of months, I'm just, how are they doing this? How are they pulling this off? And then about a month ago, I got sent a link to your presentation on this at the CCA roundtable. And that's the title, Legislating Totalitarianism in British Columbia. And boy, it all came together. That's when I learned that there were 3 acts passed into law, not just HPOA, that they didn't just go out there and restructure the Health Act and go, okay, we're going to take control. We're tired of these doctors that thought they could just walk away without getting treated. And everything else. And it just now it makes sense. So there's too much to talk about the full 3 acts. So I'd like to focus today more on the Health Professions and Occupations Act. And hopefully we can do more on the Legal Professions Act and the Emergencies and Disasters Management Act down the road, and sooner, I hope. But let's talk about the HPOA. And I mean, health professionals are leaving the province. They are fleeing the province, and it's a bad situation here. So many people don't even have a family doctor, but if their family doctor can't even provide the services that he wants to provide ethically and morally, and due to his training and knowing you if you've been his patient for 10 years and has to follow a political appointee's direction. But I got to go back. I get lost when I start thinking about this stuff. So in your presentation at the CCCA, I had to make notes because I knew I would I would distract myself. You cover the three acts that have already been passed into law. Why don't we know about them?
Well, the way that they were developed and then tabled in the Legislative Assembly and passed, the whole process was really shrouded in secrecy. And that's contrary to the spirit of democratic lawmaking right from the get-go. In a democracy, when you're passing new laws, when you have a draft bill in the works, the essential is transparency. So there has to be notice given that a change to the law is being contemplated, and notice to the public and notice to those affected. And there has to be adequate information provided by the government to those affected. And in the case of the Health Professions and Occupations Act, every single resident of British Columbia is affected because we all depend upon our healthcare providers, and what we're depending upon them for is personalized, consent-based healthcare. That's the type of healthcare that Canada offers. When I say personalized, I mean you go into your physician and who knows you. And your physician has a duty to provide you with the information you need to make informed choices about your health, about the course of medical treatment you want to undergo or not, or choose not to undergo. And your choices, your doctor knows that your choices will be conditioned by choices regarding the life you want to lead, your values. And even two identical health circumstances may not be treated in the same way with two different individual patients. And, this is what we expect from healthcare in a rights-based rule of law democracy like we have in Canada. A rights-based rule of law democracy like we ought to have in Canada. Because in the last 4 years, we've seen constant systematic infringements of rights and freedoms, and also a curtailing of the possibility of judicial review when government engages in overreach that infringes rights and freedoms.
Right. Well, but that's
I've kind of taken a detour, but
yeah.
just quickly to come back to answering your question.
Right.
The entire process was kept out of the public eye, and it was also kept the process of lawmaking that contributed to the development of the HPOA, which was first Bill 36. It was shrouded in secrecy. It was not shown to our healthcare providers either. They were not consulted, and they were the people who really needed to be consulted.
It was my understanding that of the 16,000 doctors and health professionals that could have been consulted, only, don't quote me on this number, but I have read this number, 49 out of the 16,000. And like you say, public discourse just wasn't available. And on top of that, they only discussed or debated, if you could use that term loosely here, less than a third of the legislation, or less than a third of the act before they called a vote on it. So
that's yeah.
That
so what the government did was David Eby's NDP government, they forced a vote through closure after and the bill was passed into act in November of 2022. And it's a very large piece of legislation with some 270 odd pages. And They forced closure of the Legislative Assembly, suspending any further reading and debate by our elected representatives. And they forced a vote and they passed it through when only a third of it had been read and debated. And in the case of laws governing the provision of healthcare, laws that concern every single resident in British Columbia, it's unconscionable, it's absolutely unacceptable that our elected representatives not read and debate every statute in that bill before considering its passage into act. The passage of this bill into act, when most of it has not been read, is already in itself a tremendous blow to democratic process and democratic governance in BC. But it's just the tip of the iceberg, because the entire process by which the act was created, no consultation, no meaningful consultation, and if you pass a bill that hasn't been read or debated, then you can't even pretend you have the tacit consent of the population that has elected the representatives who sit in Parliament. So there's no notice, there's no information given to the public, there's no opportunity for public debate, there's no meaningful consultation of those affected or those professionally concerned. There's no review and no proper debate by our elected representatives.
Right. Well, closer to home, since I became aware of the HPOA, I happen to live near a fantastic hiking spot, and that's how I clear my head. I hike up this little mountain 3, 4, 5 times a week, and I run into people on the trail up and down every day. When I'm in town, it's shopping or for whatever reason, I'm running into people. I have not met a single person since last November that I've asked if they've heard about the HPOA. Has one single person said, yeah, that really pisses me off. Not a single person is even aware of it. So and it seems to me like the first part of this plan is to institute a culture of fear into the health professionals, so they shut up now and they don't start talking to anybody and letting their patients know that this is going on. So you can't hear from the media. The media is bought and captured. You can't hear from your doctors because they face these penalties. Why can't they go get lawyers? Why can't they get a lawyer to go and help fight this?
Well, the HPOA it's not in force yet. It has been passed into act, but it's not in force yet. But during the declared pandemic...
Well, hang on a second.
Healthcare physicians... Yes?
No, hang on a second. Sorry, I got to interrupt you here. All right, so I was talking with a chiropractor friend of mine the other day who is aware of the HPOA. And the chiropractors are the first health profession group that are up for their license renewal, I believe, at the end of May. I think it's like they're the first group. And right. That although the HPOA, my understanding too, is that it's not fully enacted, but that it is law, and it could be implemented. They could use and brandish it with these chiropractors when they apply for renewing their licenses for the next year.
Absolutely. So licensing is one of the major concerns that people have, that healthcare professionals have in relation to this act. And the minister in charge and the many appointees that the minister can delegate authority to, they have the authority to insist upon, to require vaccination for licensing, to require a whole host of conditions be met by licensees in order to practice. And one of the problems here is that the colleges which oversee healthcare workers, they are naturally run by healthcare professionals who are competent in the domain that is regulated. It's a democratic body that is self-governing. And there's a good reason for this. If you want the proper ethical standards to be implemented within healthcare, then the people who need to be thinking about these ethical standards are the healthcare workers themselves. What we have with the HPOA is a raft of appointees who have complete control over ethical standards and treatment procedures, but who are not required to have competence in the healthcare professions.
Like no expertise
That's
at all.
a very bizarre thing. So the HPOA actually identifies healthcare professionals as people whose profession in and of itself poses a risk to residents of British Columbia. And in a way, the HPOA thus identifies the healthcare workers in a sort of adversarial manner right from the beginning. And the idea is that the HPOA is protecting British Columbians from these healthcare workers.
Yes.
The problem is that now we have appointees with no competence in the domain who are put in charge of regulating, who are put in charge of determining the ethical standards, who are put in charge even of determining procedural standards and treatment options that are acceptable. And these people do not have to have any competence in the health professions. And they are also authorized to bring in policy and legislation into BC in the context of one or other healthcare emergency from other jurisdictions and other lawmaking bodies or rulemaking bodies. And that includes the WHO, the WHA, the WEF. And so what you have potentially is a host of administrators who are career bureaucrats, who have no competence in healthcare, and who are simply bringing into BC legislation from other jurisdictions, right, at the behest of corporate power structures, right, that are pursuing a profit-driven agenda, a profit and control-driven agenda. Now, what has happened is with the HPOA, the healthcare professionals have lost the ability to govern themselves completely. All of the board that's going to govern in their colleges, the boards will be entirely appointed. And so there will be no independence from government. Now, if our government was some sort of immaculate, angelic host, that might be okay. But we all know that during the declared pandemic, the policies, there were major infringements of rights and freedoms, and there was a tremendous amount of harm done. And then, after the declared pandemic ceased, there was very little ability for people to pursue remedy through the courts because the public health officers were insulated against any judicial review using administrative law principles. Well, as bad as that was, and as egregious as the complete absence of remedy for those harmed by these policies has been, the HPOA will make it much, much worse, because written into this legislation is the fact that the administrators, the decision makers within these processes, will not be subject to punitive action by the courts. Their authority cannot be questioned, and after the fact, any harm that they've done, they cannot be pursued for it. On the one hand, we've identified healthcare workers who are there to serve us and to make sure that, to do no harm, and to make sure that we have the information required for informed consent so that we can choose our own course of health and healing. But these health professionals have been identified as a kind of adversary or potential for harm that has to be controlled by the colleges. The colleges are entirely constituted by administrative appointees now, and they will determine the type of healthcare we get, so that when I go to, or you go to your healthcare professional, your physician, and you want them to personalize a course of care for you or for your loved ones, if any of the things that they might recommend to you go against what has been set out by these appointees within the regulatory colleges, then they will simply not recommend them, even if they believe, according to their, relying upon their expertise and their experience, even if they believe that is absolutely the best course of treatment for you, they will not recommend it. And if they do, they will risk losing their license and some heavy punitive measures that can come down upon them. And this is why it's very important that someone like myself speak on behalf of healthcare professionals, because I'm not a healthcare professional. I'm just a layperson who's doing my best to inform myself, because I recognize that the healthcare professionals themselves are not in a position to speak freely, that they have been targeted throughout the declared pandemic. All those who spoke up and who insisted upon medical ethics and who did the right thing, a very heavy hand came down upon them.
You might think you can get away with that now, and I'm in the same boat as you. This is what I do. I talk to people about this kind of stuff. Well, not this like this happens every day. I talk to health professionals, and my goal is to help people manage their own health care. I mean, personally, I haven't seen a doctor. Actually, that's not. I was going to say since 2000, but that's not quite true. I did once have a pain in my knee that was so bad in 2006 or around there. I went to a doctor, and he prescribed me an anti-inflammatory and what was the other one? Anti-inflammatory and an anti-inflammatory and some kind of pain med or something. Anyways, when I hobbled back to my studio in New West then. That was when I was actually broadcasting my radio show, Total Health Radio Show, out of the basement of bottom floor of the Boucher Institute of Naturopathic Medicine. I was right across the street from the PharmaSafe clinic there. And I looked at the ingredients, and I looked at the everything. Side effects, liver damage, kidney failure. I just went through this long list. And I called my functional medicine doctor, an ND, and I explained my situation, and he said, "Oh, geez, John, just go back across the street to PharmaSafe and get a bottle of castor oil, rub it on your knee 3 times a day, wrap it with a tensor bandage to keep it off your clothes in your bed at night, and you'll be fine in a couple of days." And boy, if I wasn't. 3 days later, I was running up and down the stairs. So if he does that now under the HPOA, loss of license.
We've seen a lot of people punished for recommending ivermectin, and and they continue to be punished and mistreated for having recommended the use of ivermectin in the early treatment of COVID.
Well, I learned something about that about a month ago. On one of my hikes, I came out of the top of the mountain there, and there was a truck sitting on the side of the road. A gentleman sitting there, and on the side of his truck was a really nice big logo. It said "Great Garlic," so I had to go over and chat with him. And he informed me about 2 pharmacies in the interior that he knows of directly, that during COVID, the government agents literally stormed into both of these pharmacies and went through all of their stock, took ivermectin, hydrochloroquine, like anything that was being reported as possible, any kind of possible application for COVID. They just confiscated it all and destroyed it.
Right. Well, it says a lot about our government and its choices that ivermectin, which has a very well-established safety profile. It's considered to be safer than over-the-counter Tylenol. That ivermectin poses a tremendous risk, and we have to stop the public from having access to it at all costs. And at the same time, we make available fentanyl to addict population that we have cut off from other assistance, so that during the declared pandemic, they have far fewer resources, fewer places to go, fewer places offering them food, but they can get fentanyl, and they can carry an enormous quantity of it around legally, when it is almost impossible for anyone outside of a hospital setting to administer safely. And so this seems like a bit of a death sentence, but it's masquerading as, well, a humanitarian measure. The humanitarian measure is to provide proper assistance to these people. They need clean clothes, they need a place to sleep, they need adequate housing, they need something to do, they need work, and they need food, and they need, in many instances, they need psychiatric care.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean sending them off to a camp, and it doesn't mean rounding them up with SWAT teams. It just means actually caring for these people, not giving them a drug that is almost impossible to self-administer, and then pretending that as long as we have emergency workers who have naloxone on them, everything will be okay. Well, if you have overdosed and your brain has been deprived of oxygen for a certain very small period of time, and then someone administers naloxone, they're not necessarily doing you any favors if you then come to and you're incapacitated for the rest of your life. That's, that in itself is another kind of nightmare. So providing fentanyl and providing naloxone, that's not the answer. Providing food, shelter, clothing, and care, that's the answer. And then cutting off ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine when these are safe treatments, safe alternative treatments for early treatment of COVID before things are critical.
Right.
Unethical, and there is no scientific basis for these policies. But these are harm measures. These are measures that have the effect of increasing, not reducing harm. And when your public health office is imposing these kinds of harm measures, there's a problem. And when there's no possibility for those harmed to seek remedy through the courts, then democracy is threatened. And democracy in BC and across Canada certainly is threatened. And there is no clearer indication of that than the fact that people harmed by these policies, these absolutely reckless, ill-advised pandemic policies, have not been able to seek remedy through the courts. That has been shut down. And in BC, this is largely owing to David Eby. David Eby has represented the provincial and territorial, he was the provincial and territorial representative of the Action Committee on Court Proceedings during COVID-19, and advising courts across Canada and in BC on how to proceed, how best to preserve court operations during COVID. But the entire time deferring at every step to the Public Health Agency of Canada, never questioning any of the modeling, never questioning any of the predictions, never questioning any of the fear-mongering that we know was delivered in person to our judges by representatives from the Public Health Agency of Canada. So here, these are very intelligent individuals who are not examining the evidence brought before them, a very uncritical reception of evidence. And somehow there's motivated thinking. Perhaps these judges thought that, by setting aside their critical faculties and by not examining any of the information provided to them by PHAC, perhaps they thought somehow this was essential to safeguard the public. But it makes no sense. The judges are there to review laws and to ensure that the rights and freedoms of individuals are not infringed. And they are not doing that. Now, the HPOA, the Health Professions and Occupations Act, everything that was wrong about the declared pandemic and everything that has prevented remedy after the declared pandemic for the harm done has been integrated, has been enshrined in writing, in law, in the Health Professions and Occupations Act, so that there can be no remedy. In this case, with the declared pandemic, there's something like motivated thinking that has gotten in the way of judges' desire to actually fulfill their responsibilities within the rule of law democratic governance system of BC and Canada. But when it comes to the HPOA, the choice is no longer on the shelf for them. They simply will not have any authority over any of the decisions made by any of the administrators. All they have to do is declare an emergency of one kind or another, and they have complete discretion. And none of the acts that they implement, none of the policies will be open to the scrutiny by the courts.
Well, and the unfortunate thing is there's going to be some time before there is going to be another election. So who knows what state the province will be in come next election. I don't know how long it's going to take.
Already we've had the Emergency and Disaster Management Act, the Health Professions and Occupations Act, and the Legal Professions Act. Each one of these was improperly developed, improperly passed, and each one of them systematically infringes rights and freedoms. The infringement of rights and freedoms is written right into these laws, but they're not alone. Then there was Bill 7, and it was shelved because the business community reacted against it. Little did they know, apparently, that the Emergency and Disaster Management Act allows the government to do everything already that Bill 7 allowed them to do. And so, in a way, the NDP government is simply laughing at the business community because Bill 7 was a redundancy. They're already able to control trade any way they like using the Emergency and Disaster Management Act. But these three, they're not alone now. There are yet another two bills. And the one thing they have in common is they completely ignore democratic lawmaking procedure. They ignore the necessity of democratic governance. And they ignore the necessity within a democracy of the protections of rights and freedoms guaranteed by, in Canada, the Charter, but also by our treaty obligations as signatory to international human rights law treaties, and by customary international law. Now, when I say ignore, that's not quite right, because when someone is passing legislation of this nature and pay no attention to democratic process, that's not by accident. David Eby is a lawyer by training, and everything that is wrong, and these laws are absolutely anti-democratic. They should never have been passed, and if the public had been allowed to had been properly informed and been given the opportunity to debate these laws, they never would have been passed. And if our members of our legislative assembly were doing their duty as elected representatives within a democratic governance system, simply doing their jobs, if they had done their jobs and they had actually read and debated the entirety of these acts, they would never have been passed. No responsible legislator would allow this to happen. if if they had any intention of upholding rule of law, democratic governance, because that's what this eliminates.
Well, I watched MLA for North Island, Anna Kindy, or Kindy, sorry. Um, she was in legislature a few weeks ago. She had the opportunity to ask the health minister a few questions, and she asked her three sets of questions. And each time there was a very long pause before the health minister would respond. And I'm recording those. I'm going to edit those and use them in a clip. But the health minister did not answer a single question. She just kept repeating, much like all we heard during COVID was flatten the curve, just 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and got to protect grandma. And you mentioned it earlier in your talk there about how the judges are thinking, well, maybe this is being done for public safety. That's all the health minister said. She just kept repeating that. She kept saying, well, keep in mind, this is for public safety, blah, 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 public safety, blah, 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 public safety, public safety, public safety, with no response to the actual questions, really. So,
Well, it's very much as though they are repeating slogans and taking their marching orders from others, and those others simply are not their constituents. So a lot of this legislation, the HPOA certainly mirrors the international health regulations, and seems to fit within the Agile Nations initiative introduced by Klaus Schwab and the WEF. And one of the things that the Agile Nations aims to do is to remove the obstruction to international corporate, the pursuit of profit and advancement of international corporate agendas, to remove the obstruction created by regulatory bodies and democratic processes. A major corporation does not run democratically. And
no.
So they run up against democratic processes that hold them back, that say, no, we have to consider the interest of the public here. And if you want to do business with the government, you want access to the taxpayer purse, then you have to submit to regulation, and that regulation is in place to protect the public.
Right.
What's happening is the corporate body is getting control over the regulatory process so that they don't have to consider the public welfare. The public is reduced to a captive consumer. Mandated consumption is the aim. You won't have a choice. You're one of the 130,000 healthcare professionals. Well, we're going to make vaccination mandatory, and if you want to renew your license, you'll have to be vaccinated for whatever it is, for whatever we tell you. And if you don't comply, then we won't have to do anything. When your license comes up for renewal, you simply will not be renewed, and you will lose your livelihood just like that. And you'll have no recourse whatsoever, because the law has been fashioned to ensure that you don't have any recourse.
Well, what stuns me, absolutely stuns me. First of all, BC was the last region in the world to drop the mandates. Even with all of the information that we had by the time they did that last June, all of the side effects, all of the admission of Pfizer executives saying, well, we never tested it for transmission. We never tested it for safety. We never tested it for... And all of the facts that came out over time that have been proven true, like all those conspiracy crazy people with the tinfoil hats like myself, who were saying all these things at the beginning, have all been proven true. BC still maintained the mandates. And then when they finally dropped the mandates, it was like 2 days later they announced the HPOA. I mean, it had already been passed into law, but now they're saying, oh, it's going into effect now. And I mean, they literally only gave the health professionals, the over 6,000 health professionals that were either fired or quit during COVID, because of their own ethical standards and their informed consent, their belief in informed consent and bodily autonomy. And that's what I got to point out here, people. This is what it's about. Like, you've lost your informed consent, your right to informed consent. You have lost your right to bodily autonomy. You do not own your body in British Columbia. Your body is now under the purview of a political appointee who, at his discretion, can decide what he wants to put in your body at practically any time. And the doctors are legally mandated to follow those orders across the board. And we're not just talking doctors, we're talking, and I don't know how they're going to manage all these different types of health professionals, but Chinese medicine, chiropractors, naturopathic doctors. I mean, how are they going to tell naturopathic doctors to prescribe Ozempic if that's not even something they can prescribe for somebody who's overweight, and the doctor wants to say, well, get some exercise and stop eating gluten and or whatever. How are they going to do that? How are they going to mandate how are they going to control an acupuncturist? Or a dentist. I mean, the dentist pulls a tooth. They can't tell the dentist to pull a tooth differently. Like, how are they? Oh, I got it. I just realized what it is. It's not so much that they're going to tell every health professional, a physiotherapist, how they're going to crack somebody's back or help them regain the mobility in their leg after an industrial accident. They're just going to make sure that physiotherapist doesn't tell that patient, oh, by the way, you got no informed consent if you go to your family doctor. They won't be able to talk about anything because that will be against the... Am I getting that? Well, is that where they're going to put the pressure on all of the various health professionals? I mean, I could see a medical doctor where they could say, okay, you have to push vaccines to your patients. Like, you have no choice. You have to get them yourself. But they're going to do that to everybody else too. So
one of the things that they're doing is they've amalgamated all of the colleges, and they're greatly reducing the number of colleges, regulatory colleges. And so all of these colleges were democratic bodies, and the healthcare practitioners or the healthcare providers, they were self-regulating. These colleges were self-regulating bodies. So now they will be entirely constituted by appointees, and then those appointees will have decision-making power over every manner over the entirety of business as usual for those professions. And then the regulatory bodies, made up entirely of appointees, they will be controlling the professionals under their purview. It won't be that the professionals will be pursuing their profession and also collectively cultivating and managing that profession. They will be pursuing their profession as controlled by, as set out by the regulatory body. And the regulatory body will be taking instruction from who knows what province, but not necessarily, the regulatory body won't necessarily be taking instruction at all from the members of the profession it's regulating. The HPOA makes possible the introduction of laws from foreign jurisdictions. And the thing is, one, the HPOA makes it possible for these appointees to govern how healthcare is provided by the professionals in their purview, but it also allows for the importation into BC of laws from other jurisdictions that will apply to healthcare decisions. But these laws, when they come into BC and they become legally binding for residents in British Columbia, These laws do not have to pass and will not pass through the Legislative Assembly. There will be no possibility whatsoever for your elected representatives to read and debate these laws. They will come into effect, they will be binding on you, and they will not be from BC. They will have
Right.
completely avoided any democratic constraint.
It's almost too much. It's it's mind-boggling. It's and in my research, I learned that there are only three single-payer health systems in the world like us, right? Canada, Cuba, and North Korea. And luckily for North Korea and Cuba, they're lucky because of all the sanctions, they don't have access to all the great pharmaceuticals that are going to be forced on us here. Those two countries have better healthcare outcomes because they were forced to rely on historical methods of treatment for a lot of conditions. And we're not
Well,
online.
I mean, one of the things that people have to do is, residents in BC have to realize that the situation is so dire for healthcare professionals that they really cannot speak on their behalf with anything like impunity. They are very likely to suffer some kind of punitive consequence if they speak out.
Right.
And most healthcare practitioners, they recognize and they do their best to observe medical ethics, and they recognize the importance of informed consent and personalized medical care, but they cannot object to what's coming down the pipeline and keep their licenses. And it's only going to get worse because with the HPOA, one of the things that's written into this legislation is that providing false or misleading information is not only it's not only a violation of policy, it's also a criminal offense. So they've criminalized the provision of false or misleading information, but they haven't defined what it is.
Oh,
and so when we
okay.
look back at the
Oh, hang on a second. I got to interrupt on this one. I just watched while I was preparing to talk with you. I had some clips running in the background on YouTube, some podcasting there, and there was an interview of Mark Carney after he got back, or after his interview or his talk with Trump? I can't recall now, because it was playing in the background. But he was saying that he is going to put a stop to. He's going to act because there's just too much misinformation on the internet. He said, just look at all those podcasters and criminals and basically evil people that are spreading he's going to do it. Like that's going to be one of his goals. So what we're talking about right now is probably going to be labeled medical terrorism, and we are going to be targeted for medical terrorism.
Well, in BC, perhaps it's easy to do this because we've got a population that is largely first or second generation, so we don't have deep roots in terms of, these are things that our grandparents or great-grandparents fought for. These are rights that are important to preserve. We don't have a kind of collective memory of fighting for rights and freedoms. And so as they're taken away from us, it's harder for us to, just in general, the general public, it's harder for us to see what is being taken away from us. But it isn't that there hasn't been opposition to the HPOA. There's been enormous opposition. There was a petition with 17,500 signatures that went through the Legislative Assembly. There was no word from the Legislative Assembly, no acknowledgement. There were 5,000 postcards objecting that were presented by John Rustad at the Legislative Assembly. There was a recall of David Eby that was launched in his own riding, his Point Grey riding, and there was over 11% of that population voting to recall the premier in that riding on the basis of his support for the HPOA, and still no acknowledgement of this opposition. And with British Columbians and with Canadians in general, very often when you have people protesting, there is a tendency to dismiss. There's a tendency to parrot the words of Justin Trudeau when he says this is a fringe minority, diminishing them, suggesting that they have nothing to offer, that there's nothing there to listen to. But the 11,000, the 11% of the population of the Point Grey riding who voted to recall Eby, these weren't a fringe minority. These were people who were informed and who were reasonably upset. And often when you look at the advocacy work that's being done, and when you look at people who are engaged, the reason that they're engaged is they care deeply and they've taken the time to inform themselves. And the more informed they become, the more pressing the need they feel to act. And they're acting on behalf not just of themselves and their families, but on behalf of all British Columbians. And for the people who are opposing the Health Professions and Occupations Act, they want informed consent, consent-based personalized medical care for everybody. We need it for the homeless on the streets at Main and Hastings, and we need it for the billionaire class in Vancouver. Apparently there are more billionaires in Vancouver than anywhere else in Canada. Well, they're not going to have rights to personalized consent-based healthcare in BC either. They may be able to fly somewhere else and get it, but this affects everybody. This is one of the reasons people come to Canada, for the healthcare system. And in BC, a few years ago, we voted against privatization of our healthcare system. And perhaps that is one of the reasons lurking in the background for the undermining of our healthcare system. And it is being undermined. All of these little municipalities across BC, the mayors are calling out to the premier saying, we need to get our emergency departments back on track. We need more staff. And they still haven't hired back they haven't apologized. They haven't given back pay. They have not addressed the terrible abuse of the fired unvaccinated nurses. What they've done with the HPOA is, after acknowledging that when the employer fired those nurses, that was not lawful, that was improper, but now they've made it a condition of licensure. And so those same nurses, if they come back, well, they won't be able to renew their license because they haven't been vaccinated. And so the harm will simply be, done to them again. They will be victimized yet again. What we need is public apologies. We need reparations. They need to be hired back. They need to have back pay. They need counseling. We need a public education program, and also an education program aimed at our elected representatives, so that they need to know, they need to have access to resources to help them identify their responsibilities vis-a-vis rule of law, democratic governance, because right now the legislation that's passing is undermining that. And that's not in anybody's interest. It's not even in the interest of the corporate powers housed in BC. There's a reason that they opposed Bill 7, but they're
not realizing it's
in their opposition.
But not realizing it's pretty much already baked into the HPOA. And the LPA and the EDMA.
The Emergency and Disaster Management Act, yes. Every single provision that the business community of British Columbia objected to, and quite rightly and eloquently in their public statements, everything they objected to is possible, and at the drop of a hat through the Emergency and Disaster Management Act. And perhaps Bill 7 was just a way of poking at the business community to see how compliant and complacent they are. And it turned out, well, not very compliant, not very complacent. But our government didn't need Bill 7. They've already got that covered.
Yeah. And they've got the courts.
So far they do, but we're seeing a sea change there. Justice Mosley, he did find the invocation of the emergency measures to be unjustified, and that, I mean, that's a very honorable thing for him to have done. Simply in this era, when so many people are turning their back on their real democratic responsibilities, their responsibilities vis-a-vis rule of law democracy, Justice Mosley did not do that, and I mean, he's going to leave a legacy in that ruling, but and hopefully,
but
I think
but
there was
okay,
a decision in the Ontario courts as
okay,
well.
well, hang on a second. What does this ruling mean? How does that impact Canadians?
Well, the changes in law that are happening in BC will allow the infringement of rights and violations to continue with complete impunity.
Correct.
So, and throughout the declared pandemic, somehow the judiciary in Canada looked away, just turned and looked the other way when in with respect to rights violations, rights infringements. But there seems to be a sea change occurring. And I mean, a great many people are realizing the enormity of the harm done by the pandemic policy, not just in Canada, but around the world. And courts around the world are waking up to this and they're responding to it. The Canadian judiciary seems, in general, to follow the American judiciary. And perhaps as things change in the United States and as more information comes to light about the extent to which the COVID policies were engineered not at all to protect the health and safety of the public, but to create mechanisms of control. This is gradually having an effect within Canada. One can hope judges are intelligent people. These are very privileged people, and perhaps because of that little bubble of privilege around them, it's difficult for them to acknowledge when they've been hoodwinked. And in this case, they certainly have. And there is a tradition in Canada, in the Canadian judiciary, of simply deferring to the government and being there to support government decisions. But when you look at the supremacy of rule of law and its fundamental supremacy of rule of law for Canadian democracy, the responsibility of our judiciary ought to be clear, right? Judicial review is something that cannot be done away with. And you cannot have democracy if you do not have judicial review when there is government overreach. And
Right.
all of this legislation, that's what it's doing. It eliminates even the possibility of review. It eliminates any kind of remedy. It allows complete or near complete control of professionals by appointed administrators, and it absolves them of any responsibility. It eliminates accountability completely.
But couldn't okay?
And
So I know
that's
we have a different legal system than the U.S., but there's and the provinces have different rights and regulations and powers versus the states in the United States. I mean, we have the power to succeed if we want, which is just amazing. There's 50 states. I said 51 states. The 50 states do not have. They can't succeed from the U.S. If Texas gets pissed off, they can't vote and leave. As we're seeing being threatened from Alberta, but there's no way the Laurentian elite are going to let Alberta leave with all that money and oil. They're just going to bleed that province dry. I was shocked to see Quebec coming out today. I haven't had time to read up on it, but I just saw something online saying the Quebec, somebody in Quebec is supporting Alberta in their right to succeed. And I thought, well, why would Quebec support that? Because Quebec is the biggest deposit of Alberta oil money in the country, right? They get 13, almost $14 billion a year in free cash. They just and of course it has to be delivered by wheelbarrow because they won't allow it to be delivered by pipeline. But yeah, I just don't see I don't see how they're going to let the cash cow Alberta leave, even though it means that the amount of revenue that the country could be bringing in by allowing Canadian provinces to actually develop their resources would put so much revenue into our coffers to pay for our health care, improve our healthcare system,
Well,
our education system, and you've got this group of people somewhere who are saying no, we have to climate emergency or go green or agenda 2030 whatever. It just completely stop all of that, suppress all of that. And they're doing that on resources. I guess my point was the rest of the country is doing that to Alberta on resources. BC government is doing it to the people.
right.
It's the same
They're
playbook.
all
It's just
different
it's
methods,
a different
different
thing.
methods of control.
Yeah, different
Methods of control, but also in Alberta, it seems that they've signed away their water rights to the U.S., the Albertan, and I believe that's a conservative measure. I'm not sure. And also, I believe that Danielle Smith is an oil lobbyist, that was by profession prior to being premier. And so she has pushed back against some terrible rights violations, but it's not clear to me that she has done this for any other reason than to secure a very strong voter base. If Danielle Smith wanted to solve the problems in Alberta, it seems like there's one clear thing she would do, and that is renegotiate royalties on the huge oil reserves. And then there would be no problem. Albertans, there is enough wealth in the Alberta oil fields for Albertans to be covered, their health care, their education. There is enough wealth there for abundance, and still for the corporate powers to wade in the wealth and power that they need and dream of. But I believe Saudi Arabia had an even worse royalty agreement before they renegotiated. And the people of Saudi Arabia do very well. The people of Alberta, not so much.
No.
So I would say that if Danielle Smith really wants to help the people of Alberta, that the first thing she would do is renegotiate the royalty agreement. Right? And then, just like you say, we need to start developing our own resources, not shipping them away. We need to refine things, and maybe the tariffs aren't that bad if they force us to develop things at home. We need to stop using, tax havens and sending things abroad and getting third world labor to make things for us on the cheap in ways that cause harm. Let's do it at home.
Yeah, so I think, you're right. In some respect, that's right. But I just think that I'm really worried about what's going to happen with the laws that we're talking about here. I'm really worried that once the HPOA is fully enacted, what is the next logical step? I look at what's happening with the Liberal Party in Canada, and now with Carney's rhetoric about how he's going to have to control information online. He has to. Now it's going to be a push for him, and we are all going to be, I don't know how he's going to label us all terrorists or whatever, but they're going to do their best so that the only information you're going to have legal access to is CBC, I suppose, and and the rest of the mainstream media. But I don't want to end this on a depressing note. I
Well,
want.
I've got an upbeat note we can end on. And
Yes.
because I do have to leave myself here, I've got more appointments.
Yes, of
But
course.
I watched a great interview that Corinne Morey, who represented the fired nurses here in BC, and just did a tremendous amount of amazing advocacy work on their behalf. Um, Corinne Morey, she interviewed Suzanne Anton. And Suzanne Anton is a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General in BC, and that's the highest sort of highest ranking official, I believe, in our legal system,
Right.
or very close. And she had some interesting things to say about the declared pandemic, and I'll just ballpark paraphrase some of the things that she said. But one of them was that we didn't do enough to protest when the infringements of rights and freedoms started happening, and maybe we protested a little bit, but not enough. And then she said, there was no basis, no scientific basis for the public health orders. We weren't given the science. They didn't tell us why.
Right.
And of course, they needed to. And she said, I wonder what would have happened if, on New Year's, everybody had just refused to comply. All the restaurants had just stayed open, and the seniors' homes had just said, no, we're not going to keep Granny isolated from her family who aren't vaccinated so that she, is suffering alone. We're not going to do that. We've made a judgment call, and we don't think that that's in the public interest, and we certainly don't think it's in the interest of the elderly under our care. And so Suzanne Anton seems to have come to the conclusion that we simply should not have complied, that we were wrong to give in to these policies and this legislation when it was clearly infringing rights and freedoms and doing harm. And she pointed out that the government can only enforce these types of policies as long as people go along with it.
Right.
And it simply is no one's duty to go along with unjust laws. We have a real duty, a real responsibility to refuse unjust laws. And that's what the HPOA is. It's an unjust law, and we all need to refuse it. And in refusing it, we need to stand up for our healthcare professionals, because they're really targeted here, right? And they will be punished severely if they speak out. And so it's time for the public to speak out on their behalf and say, we absolutely reject the HPOA. We reject this type of legislation that ignores democratic process. We want a reinstatement of democratic lawmaking. We want a renaissance, a democratic renaissance. That's what we really need. And we insist that our elected representatives are accountable and responsible for their actions. And they need to act as though they are elected representatives in a functional democracy. Because right now, it looks like they're representing the interests of some unseen cabal when they're making laws in secret and passing them improperly, and the laws themselves enshrine rights violations. There is no whiff of democracy about that. That speaks to despotic lawmaking, and that this is the type of thing that creates conditions for an unjust society in which the people suffer, and we don't want it. So I think we need to do exactly as Suzanne Anton, the former Attorney General and Minister of Justice, has suggested, and that is simply refuse to comply with unjust laws.
Right. And then I think one of the worst things that could have happened to us was how the government reacted to the truckers convoy, right? When they shut down all the bank accounts and went after grannies who donated $20. I think that's in the back of people's mind. Like, if I protest, boy, they're going to shut down my bank account. They're weaponizing all this stuff against us. But you're right. We need to get the word out, and we need to do that. I remember when I was in the military, I did my Canadian military duty here out of CFB Chilliwack back in the 70s, 2 years, and prior to that in the reserves. And then I transferred to CFB Chilliwack. One of the things that we were taught, and it was part of our code, was you can refuse an order if that order violates human rights, law, and so on. And that was part of our code.
It's certainly not part of the HPOA.
Not anymore.
There's not even an acknowledgement of medical ethics or the right to informed consent or the right to refuse unwanted medical intervention or the right to refuse medical or scientific experimentation. There's none of that. And that's not a small problem. That's simply a sign of what type of legislation this is.
Right.
And it is not the type of legislation that belongs to democracy.
It certainly does not. I want to thank you for your time. I hope we can continue this conversation. I would like to dig more into the LPA and the EDMA. If you can free up some time for us, to get more into the nitty gritty of how that happened. I really loved Odessa's take on it at Liberty Talk Canada. I watched her whole show twice. Her passion and her disbelief, like mine was. But you didn't get a chance to have a conversation with her. She actually just used your presentation, and she did commentary, did play-by-play on it. But she did a really good job.
She did a great job.
She really did. I actually reached out to her. I was hoping to be able to actually get a clip of talking with her about how that went, like how she got involved, and especially what the reaction has been since she did that. I'm really curious about the reaction, so hopefully I can follow up with her, or she will follow up with my request. Anybody else that you'd like to point in our direction that we can also help, we can talk with? I just think that every single person that does any kind of public-facing work like this, any podcaster, I've commented on so many podcasters' channels on YouTube and Rumble.
Well, at some point, you definitely want to talk to Gail Davidson. I mean, her...
yes, that's in my work.
Anything that I know about the HPOA, I know as a result of working with Gail and benefiting from her insights. And she's the founder of Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada and specializes in international human rights law.
Okay.
And she would be a great person to talk to. And so would Liam Sturgis, who has done some tremendous work and most recently has done a great deal of work on the Action Committee on Court Proceedings during COVID-19. And he would have a lot to say about possible improprieties that endanger judicial independence, undermine judicial independence, have the potential to significantly undermine judicial independence in Canada, and particularly in BC.
Okay. Terrific. I will definitely reach out to those people and try and get them on the program. And again, anybody else that you come across, you say, go talk to John at Total Health. He's willing to spend time with you too. I would greatly appreciate that. I will put all the links to everybody that we've discussed, or the things we've discussed today, sites and whatnot, for content for people to do their own research. And I got to go for a walk. I have to go for a hike and process all of this. So, Dr. Matthew Cockle, thank you for this. Dr. Matthew Cockle has been my guest. Legislating Totalitarianism in British Columbia is a presentation I can't recommend more to people to watch. Matthew, thank you. Keep up the great work, and stay in touch.
Cheers. Thanks a lot, John.
Take care. Again, I want to thank Dr. Matthew Cockle for making us all aware of what we are facing. And I'm just going to go through my notes here. I summed up my notes for this talk because I knew that there's so much to think about here. But to sum up, Legislating Totalitarianism in British Columbia argues the three recent provincial laws, the Emergency and Disaster Management Act, Health Professions and Occupations Act, and the Legal Professions Act, mark a shift from democracy to authoritarianism. Passed with minimal review, secrecy, and no consultation, these acts empower unelected administrators to override charter rights, bypassing judicial and legislative oversight. The EDMA grants ministers unchecked powers for vague emergencies, while the HPOA and LPA dismantle health and legal professionals' autonomy, mandating compliance and criminalizing dissent. Linked to the WHO and the WEF agendas, the laws prioritize corporate interests over public rights, creating a medical police state and eroding independent legal recourse. Health professionals face license loss, fines, and ethical conflicts, while the public loses access to consent-based care, independent representation, and democratic protections. Dr. Cockle labels this a totalitarian transition, where laws weaponize state power, suppress dissent, and maintain a democratic facade, threatening British Columbians' freedoms and trust in institutions. Well, stay tuned. This movie will not have a happy ending unless all of us get involved. Dissenting health professionals face loss of license, fines, and jail time if they speak out. So it's up to us, you and me. Otherwise, one day very soon, an emergency will be declared and the full weight of the police state will come down on all of us. Please get informed. Ask questions. If informed consent, bodily autonomy, and freedom of speech are as important to you as they are to me, then we got to fight. We got to speak out. We got to do something. So do your homework. Talk to your friends and family. Help them understand what's going on. And stay tuned. Much more on this to come on Total Health. And in the meantime, stay healthy and stay safe.